In the years leading up to the catastrophe, Boston's North End was a bustling, noisy, and restless corner of the city, a labyrinth of narrow streets, brick tenements, and the salty scent of the harbor. Immigrant families from Italy, Ireland, and Portugal crowded into small apartments. Their lives pulsed to the rhythm of the waterfront, the clang of metal, the rumble of carts, the whistle of ships docking with goods from all over the world. It was a time of industry, ambition, and unchecked optimism. America was changing, and so was Boston. Across the harbor, the steel giants were rising. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, had seen a chance to profit in a booming new world. Industrial alcohol, distilled from molasses, was essential for munitions and other wartime products. The First World War in Europe was raging, and the demand for alcohol-based explosives had skyrocketed. Molasses, that thick, sweet syrup, a byproduct of sugarcane refining, was the golden liquid that could be turned into gold itself. And Boston, with its easy access to Caribbean trade routes, was the perfect place to store it. In 1915, USIA began to search for land to build a massive storage tank, one large enough to hold over 2 million gallons of molasses. Their choice fell upon Commercial Street, in the heart of the North End, where the elevated railway tracks shadowed the street below. The site overlooked the harbor and sat near the Purity Distilling Company's plant, which USIA owned. Construction began quickly and carelessly. There were deadlines to meet, profits to chase, and no patience for bureaucracy. The tank was enormous, 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, and it dominated the skyline like a dark metal monster. But from the very beginning, it was flawed. The tank was built under the supervision of Arthur Gell, a manager with no engineering background. The pressure to finish before another shipment of molasses arrived was immense. The company skipped safety tests and inspections. Rivets were hammered in hastily. Some leaked even before the tank was filled. When the first gallons of molasses were pumped in, local children noticed something strange. The tank groaned. At night, people living nearby said it made low, metallic moaning sounds like a living thing in pain. But they shrugged it off. Industrial noise was part of life in Boston's North End. By early 1916, workers had reported leaks, thin, sticky streams of molasses running down the tank's sides. Instead of draining it to repair the faults, USIA painted the tank brown, hoping to hide the leaks. The paint masked the problem, not the danger. The community adapted. Children learned to scoop up molasses drippings from the ground with sticks, licking the sweet syrup before their mother caught them. Horses slowed as their hooves stuck slightly to the syrupy patches on the street. The tank became part of the neighborhood's strange identity, a towering, sweet-smelling landmark. Then came 1917. The United States entered the war. The tank's purpose became even more urgent. The molasses it stored would be processed into ethanol, used for munitions, explosives, and industrial alcohol. Every shipment that arrived from the Caribbean meant profit for USIA and risk for Boston. Inside the company, there were warnings. A few engineers expressed concern about the tank's structure. "It's not safe," one of them reportedly said. "It was never pressure tested properly." But their voices were small compared to the roar of profit. The war was good for business. The tank kept filling, emptying, and refilling, each cycle putting new stress on its fragile shell. Meanwhile, the neighborhood beneath it grew and changed. Immigrants found work at the nearby docks. The air often smelled of bread, smoke, and molasses, a strange sweetness that coated the senses. Children played stickball in the shadow of the tank, their laughter echoing against its steel walls. In 1918, the war finally ended. Across the city, people celebrated peace. But for USIA, the future was uncertain. The demand for industrial alcohol was falling, and the company still had millions of gallons of molasses to store and sell. The tank, that looming, rumbling cylinder, remained filled nearly to the brim. By January 1919, Boston's winter was bitterly cold. The harbor had a thin crust of ice. The city's streets were gray and sluggish under the frost. But on the morning of January 13, 1919, a new shipment of molasses arrived. 600,000 gallons, warm from the Caribbean. Workers pumped it into the tank, mixing the warm syrup with the cold, thick molasses already inside. No one realized what that would do, how the heat, the expansion, and the internal pressure would combine like a ticking bomb. A few men nearby heard strange popping sounds from the tank that week, like distant gunfire. Horses refused to walk close to it. Some residents swore the tank was groaning louder than ever. On January 15, 1919, the sun rose over Boston as usual, a pale, cold light reflecting off the harbor. The North End was alive with routine. Dock workers shouting, children running to school, delivery carts rattling on cobblestones. No one could have guessed that within an hour, their world would drown in sweetness and death. The tank stood silent for the last time. By the winter of 1918, Boston stood at the threshold of a new century's promise. The war had ended, soldiers were coming home, and industries across America were shifting from munitions back to consumer production. The city's harbor, always the lifeline of its commerce, was busier than ever. And there, looming over the waterfront like an iron colossus, stood the Great Molasses tank on Commercial Street. To the business world, it was a symbol of progress, a monument to modern industry and the American drive for profit. To the neighborhood, it was simply the tank, familiar, unremarkable, and yet somehow ominous in its stillness. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, was making one last desperate push to turn its remaining stock of molasses into money. Its subsidiary, the Purity Distilling Company, operated the facility, and its job was simple: receive the syrup from the Caribbean, store it, and then send it off to refineries in Cambridge and beyond. But few outside the company knew what that tank really was: a steel shell of hurried ambition built without a single qualified engineer's signature. The men behind the tank. The man most associated with the tank, Arthur Gell, was not a villain, at least not in the way people imagined later. He was a company man, loyal, efficient, and driven by results. But he was not an engineer. When the idea of the tank first arose in 1915, he had merely followed orders from the top: get it built, and get it built fast. The war wouldn't wait. Every delay meant lost profits. The USIA executives in New York wanted capacity, the biggest tank possible. Gell, eager to prove himself, hired a local construction crew, sourced riveted steel plates, and began the project without waiting for formal permits or stress tests. It was, by modern standards, reckless. But in the early 20th century, industrial safety regulations were minimal, and corporate oversight was often limited to one man's judgment. When the tank was completed in December 1915, it had never been filled to capacity. There was no proper hydrostatic test, the standard procedure of filling a tank with water to check for leaks or weak spots. Instead, they filled it with molasses almost immediately. From the first load, it leaked. The warnings ignored. Residents began to notice the smell first, a sharp, sugary odor that hung in the air around Commercial Street. Workers and children could see dark, sticky trails oozing down from the seams of the tank. It became a minor curiosity, something to talk about. When one worker told Gell about the leaks, his response was dismissive. Molasses doesn't leak through steel. But it did. To silence complaints, and perhaps his own conscience, Gell ordered the tank painted brown. It wasn't for decoration, it was to disguise the leaks. The dark syrup blended into the color of the paint, hiding evidence of the tank's weakness. Still, the moaning sounds persisted. When the temperature dropped, the steel contracted and the rivets groaned under the strain.